Okay, this is a lesson on describing the motion of kinematics graph. This is actually the second video in a three-part video, which touch on the basics of gradient. Okay, so first for the content, in the very first video, we already talked a lot on the basics of gradient. In this second video, we will add a little bit more information about gradient before we can move on to the third video, which is to use this information to describe the motion of the kinematics graph. So let us recap on what we have learned in the first video. In the first video, we define for you what is a gradient, which is the steepness of a slope. And then we also talk about the types of gradient that we will face. Basically, it is how steep a slope is, and also what is the difference between a constant versus a curve, as well as the usage of a tangent for a curve. So with this information, and also we also remember that what is the difference between a positive and negative gradient. Let us define some of these graphs in terms of their gradient. So in the first case, if let's say you have a horizontal line, okay, in this case, if you have a horizontal line that's running straight through the x-axis, you will expect that the gradient is 0. Okay, so this is a 0 gradient. Now, if you have a vertical line that's running upwards, you expect the gradient to be infinite. Now, how about you have these two cases? Now, for this case, again, it is pointing to the top right, and the gradient is constant. So top right means that the gradient is positive. So you must add these two information together and you get positive constant gradient. Now similarly for this case, the gradient is negative because it's pointing bottom right and it's constant. So you add these two information together, you get a negative constant gradient. I hope that you could understand the way that it's being defined. Okay, so this is just adding all the characteristics that we have learned in the first video to describe the gradient. Now we also mentioned in the end of the first part of the video, in the first video, that there's a question on whether this curve is increasing gradient or decreasing gradient. So I also mentioned that in order to find out whether it's increasing or decreasing, we can always track the tangent, the gradient of the tangent at maybe 2 or 3 points on the curve. Now, what do you think? Is it increasing or decreasing? Have you come up with your answer? Basically, the answer is it is increasing. Okay, sorry. So why is it increasing? If you look at the 3 lines here and then you bring them down to examine the 3 tangent lines, you realize that the gradient for these 3 lines are getting from low gradient to mid and then to high gradient. So obviously the gradient is increasing. That's why it is a increasing gradient. Now let us look at another curve. If I give you a second curve which is like that, and then let's say we choose 3 points and we check the gradient. Okay, do you think it's increasing or decreasing? So obviously it's decreasing. And why? Because again, we can examine the 3 tangent and we realize that it's going from high gradient to low gradient, from high gradient to mid to low gradient. So it's actually a decreasing gradient. Okay, so I hope that you are able to follow and understand this. If you at any point you are not sure, you can go and rewind that parts and view again. Okay, so with this information, I come to the last slide of this gradient basic 2, which is if you are given a curve, how will you describe the gradient? So again, we must remember that we need to add the positive or negative part of the gradient. If the curve is pointing to the top right, obviously it's positive. Pointing to the bottom right is negative. So the first one will be positive something. Let's look at the tangent now. Now the tangent gradient is going from a very gentle to a very steep. So this is going to be low to high, so it's increasing. So it's going to be positive increasing gradient. Now for the second case, it's going from high to low, and again it's a positive gradient. So we can say that it's a positive decreasing gradient. Now what happens if you have a negative gradient? This is a negative gradient, but then it's going from gentle to steep or low to high, but in a negative direction. So it's negative increasing gradient. And also for the last one, negative gradient again, but it's from high to low. So it's going to be negative decreasing gradient. So with this understanding, I hope that you are following well. If not, you can go and rewind to the part that you are not sure. But if you have this understanding of how to describe the gradient, you can go to the next video and try to describe the motion using gradient. Okay, thank you, and see you in the next video.